I have to be careful. I have a big voice without a microphone. Good morning to everyone. I'm Clark County Commissioner Susan Brager, and it's with really gratitude that I feel like I can stand before you today and welcome each and every one of you for this morning and for this event that's taking place today. It's amazing when we can be proactive and we can work with people and help people. As a parent and a grandparent, actually a great-grandparent, former school board member, I really know that as I speak that many of us have nothing more important than the security and safety of our children. And so being here today is to give some ideas, some help, some pointers, some suggestions that can make a difference as we move forward. The attack that happened on October 1st has touched everyone who lives here. I don't think I ever pass anyone that doesn't have something to say on where can I go, how do I get help, how do I help my neighbor, how do I help the person in another state or in another country. Clark County is deeply appreciative of those who organize this workshop as an event that speaks specifically to parents, teachers, and those in our community who work with our children. They have a different life nowadays. Real time is right there in front of them, and I think that's a little bit unfortunate that real time is life for them, and they see so many different things that is real, and I think I'm glad that we're here. So it's pretty much a lifelong resident. I could not be, more proud of our community, how we've rallied together. We always knew we were like that, and it's unfortunate that something as tragic as October 1 showed that we were like that and let the world know that we're more than a town of gambling and hotels, that we are a town of people that care, and we know that that violence created an amazing outpouring of love and compassion and support. Today's workshop is an example of how we are working to support one another and to build that strength and to make sure that the compassion and care is there for each and every person that needs that help. So special thanks to a few of the organizers who made this happen today: the Southern Nevada chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Vegas Strong Resiliency Center, which we really appreciate also, and Dr. David Schoenfeld, our keynote speaker. You know, together we really are Vegas Stronger. And that mantra is something I think we need to remember every day, that we are Vegas Stronger and that we are here for everyone that was affected and needs the help of all of those that are here today. So now let me introduce Dr. Pamela Greenspun, a Las Vegas pediatrician and Vice President of the Nevada chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics. Dr. Greenspun, thank you for being here today. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Good morning. I'd like to thank everyone for coming this morning, and I'd like to introduce you to our workshop. We are here to support children after crisis and loss 1 year later. We will have Dr. David Schoenfeld speaking first, and then we have a panel of representatives from different local organizations who will be available for any questions. To my right, we have Kelly Thomas Boyers, who's president and co-founder of Adams Place. We also have Terry Keener, who is a licensed clinical social worker and behavioral health coordinator from the Vegas Strong Resiliency Center. Dr. Tammy Malich, who is the assistant superintendent, Education Services Division, Clark County School District, and also Rebecca Salazar, who's the coordinator for the Nevada Victim of Crime program. Dr. David Schoenfeld is the director of the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement. He has spoken over 1,000 times on this topic of supporting children after crisis and loss. He has consulted our own community after the 1 October shootings. Please help me welcome Dr. David Schoenfeld.
Good morning. So what I would like to do in the time that I have is to discuss really how do we support children and families after crisis situations. And I'm going to focus part of the presentation really on the October 1st shooting that happened here. But I want to say that this information is relevant if you're talking about a child who's dealing with a different crisis. So it might be a personal or a family crisis. So you would use the same strategies and approaches. And part of the reason I say that is for some people, they're going to ask, why are we still talking about this? And they may even resent a focus that continues discussion about an event that happened a year ago because they may not want the community to be remembered by that tragedy, or they may want to feel that in some ways the community has moved on or past that. And I'll come back to kind of the time course of recovery. But whenever you have mass shootings or other major crisis events, children and adults, even if they aren't directly impacted by that particular event, may find that that event will remind them of other risks in their lives, and they may feel impacted even when they had no direct link to it. I have one daughter who lives in New York City, and she contacted me right after the Paris nightclub attack. She actually texted me, and she just said, "Dad, going out to a nightclub, should I be worried?" So I texted back, "Please get on the phone." I don't like doing this by text message. And so she got on the phone, and I'm like, "What? I'm worried about what?" And she said, "Well, there was just a terrorist attack in Paris, and there's some discussion on social media that this might be a coordinated attack in multiple cities across the world, and I figure New York City is another major city. So I'm going out to a nightclub tonight. Should I be concerned and reconsider going?" So I said, "Well, dear, you know, the actual risk of going into any nightclub anywhere in the country and having a terrorist attack is very low. It's more likely if there was any shooting that occurred, it wouldn't be terrorism. It might be more interpersonal conflict or gang-related." She said, "Oh, Dad, that happened last weekend." I go, "Okay, thanks for sharing that." I don't think a club she was at, but she said, "That does happen." And I said, "So the actual risk is quite low?" And she said, "Dad, it is quite low, and I recognize that. It's just a little bit more than it was yesterday." So these events impact us across the country and across the world, often in very subtle ways. People have talked about it as really a threat to your assumptive world. This sense that you have certain assumptions that allow us to feel less vulnerable than we actually are, that allow us to feel that we can move on with our day without worrying about all the things that could happen. And then we're confronted by something that does happen, and we realize it's assumptions that no one would use a gun to harm someone else. It's an assumption that no one would cross a dotted line in the street and hit someone else head on and kill them. These are all assumptions that allow us to continue through our day without feeling so vulnerable. So kids are going to be affected by this, and we need to recognize that. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about really how do you support children after a crisis, and then I'm going to turn to some of the symptoms of adjustment reactions, so what you might see that will indicate that maybe your child or a child that you're caring for is having more distress. I'll talk some about the timeline for adjustment. I'd want to touch on adult self-care, because in order to take care of our children, we need to take care of ourselves. And then we'll end with where do you go for help, and that's where I'll be bringing in the panel, because they know the resources here and they are the resources. So we'll shift to that. What I wanted to do was, and I realized I don't know exactly how to start the video clip, but I'm going to start this video clip. It's only about 2 minutes long, and I think it illustrates very nicely that we really can provide support to kids just by being an empathic presence. So it isn't so much that I'm asking, educators or others who work with children to provide counseling or intervention to kids, but it's to recognize that these events have an impact on them and to be a support for them in an empathic presence.
2 years ago, I had a student come back from a funeral, and the kids told me that his mother was in the hospital and that's why he hasn't been at school. I said, "Oh, okay." So then when he came back, I said, "Jonathan," he said, "My mom passed." I had no idea. No one warned me. And I said, "Jonathan," and I hugged him, and then I looked at him, and I was gonna lose it because my heart, your mother, and he looked at me and he goes, "Jackie, please don't." And I said, "Okay." So he didn't want to talk about it. And the only thing I let him know is, when you're ready, I'm here. And we're all here for you. And my door is always open. And, maybe 3 weeks later, he came to me and said, "Thank you." And I look up from my desk. What are you thanking me for? He said, I just want you to know thank you. And I said, you know, Jonathan, you're welcome. And I don't know what I did. He goes, you were here and I didn't have to talk about it. So I realized then, you know, I wish I realized that sooner. Sometimes you don't want to talk about it. You want to be somewhere where you can forget that you're grieving. So I think you have to, as an educator, it's like a dance. I'm going to take a step forward. If you start the dance with me, I can take the next step. If they stop and they're not able to, okay, we can stay here and just listen to the music.
And really, when you have a community disaster, that's often what you are doing, is just being with someone and listening to the music together. So I'm going to talk about what you can talk to children about, but I want to make it quite clear that sometimes it's just being present with them. It's just letting them know that we'll get through this together, and I will share with you how I am doing and what strategies I find work, and hopefully you will share with me as well. So in the immediate aftermath of major crisis events like the shooting that occurred here, you'll often hear some discussion about providing psychological first aid. And psychological first aid should be provided broadly to all those who are impacted by the event, and it involves offering psychoeducation and supportive services with the goal to foster effective and normative coping strategies and adjustment. What you're trying to do is accelerate the natural healing process through this support. The point I'd like to make is that all adults who work with children, whether they be parents, whether they be teachers, whether they be front office staff, whether they be the receptionists at a pediatrician's office, they all should understand the likely reactions and be able to help children and adults cope with distress. Because anyone that interacts with children can be a source of further support, but they can also, if they appear insensitive, uncaring, or unconcerned, may actually become a source of further distress to people. I went to one school, they had a hostage situation and then a shooting and a student who was murdered. And I was talking with them, and one of the groups I met was the cafeteria workers. And I asked them how they thought the kids were doing, and they said, well, we're worried because the girls are wearing long sleeve shirts. I said, why would that concern you? And they looked at me and they said, well, they get on the lunch line, they hold out the trays, the sleeves retract, and we can see they're cutting more. But we don't think the mental health staff in the school know that. So I asked them, did you tell them? And they're like, well, we're cafeteria workers. We don't provide advice on that. And so they have, support staff often have different observations. I also talked with the custodial staff in that school. And they said they were concerned because the kids seemed out of control. And I said, well, what do you mean by out of control? Could you give me an example? One of the custodians looked at me and said, the other day I was in the lunchroom and the kids got up and they left their trays behind. So I reminded them that they had to bust their trays. But they ignored me and they kept walking. So I stopped them and I said, if you don't pick up those trays, no one else is going to clean up after you. So the kids went over, they picked up the tray, they went to the door, and they threw the trays out of the building. Turned to the custodian and said, are you happy now? They're not on the table anymore. And the custodian looked at me and he said, these are really good kids, and they would have never done this before the shooting. And what worries me most is they will not do that in front of the principal, in front of the teachers, or in front of their parents. We see a very different side of these kids, and we're concerned about them. So all people see and have different connections with kids. We want them all to be ready to support them. Now, it's not just about a shooting. It could be that there's conflict at home, that there's a death that's occurred of a family member or friend. Kids come to school, they come to clinic, they come to community sites, upset often about something that's happened to them. And we really want every adult to be able to help them, at least at some level. So I'm going to go over the steps that are in psychological first aid as described by the American Red Cross. And I do want to point out that this is actually intended for use with people you don't know. This is something that you're supposed to do in about 10 to 15 minutes with someone who is a stranger. So I'll just go over it in case you're working with kids in other settings. So the first is observation or awareness, and I'm going to address some of the common symptoms of adjustment difficulties shortly. You then want to make a connection, help people feel comfortable and at ease, and be kind, calm, and compassionate. People tend to pick up on the affective tone of how you are speaking more than the actual content of what you said when it's a distressing situation. I remember going with a staff member who worked with me. She asked me to come to her first meeting with her oncologist after she was diagnosed with cancer, and she went along with her husband as well. I sat through the appointment, which was about an hour long, and I think the oncologist did an excellent job. The explanations were clear. He talked about the surgery that she gave consent for, talked about the chemotherapy she was going to start, talked about what he expected as prognosis. And then when we left, she looked at me and said, "So I don't have cancer." And I said, "Why would you say that? You just gave written consent for the removal of your cancer tumor and to start chemotherapy." And all she could say was, "He seems so hopeful." And I said, "Yes, he's hopeful it will be successfully cured, but you do have cancer, don't you realize that?" And she just kept saying, "But he seems so hopeful." She was very anxious, of course, during this visit. She picked up only on the affect. So we need to then think about our affect when we're supporting people who are in distress if our goal is to try and help them feel calmer. I should tell you, people tell me I'm very calming, and so sometimes they have trouble staying awake, so I apologize for that. I'll try and spice it up a little bit, but that is part of who I am, so that's what you get. So the next thing is to assist with basic needs. Individuals who have been through traumatic situations often have some impact on their day-to-day needs as well. I was in New Orleans after Katrina, and I remember hearing about a preacher. Somebody told me that they were at church on Sunday, and the preacher was in the middle of the sermon, and someone's cell phone went off. And the audience started to kind of make noise and murmur about how inappropriate it was to keep your cell phone on. And at that point, the preacher stopped the sermon, and he just turned to the audience and he said, "That call might be your contractor. You better take it." What he was communicating was that literally even the word of God is not as important as making sure that you and those you care about are safe. And so when we attend to basic needs of people, we are not doing that instead of attending to their emotional well-being. That is the first step. And so you want to make sure, and the person who told me this story just looked at me and said, "My preacher, he gets us." And that's what you want. So if you're in a leadership position, you want people to know that you get them. You understand what their concerns are. So you'll find that a lot of kind of the federal and local response is to meet some of these immediate needs: money, assistance with transporting bodies, helping them find a place to live, making sure they have food. That is the first part of attending to people's emotional needs and is an important thing to keep in mind. You then need to listen to people and then give them realistic reassurance. You don't want to give individuals false reassurance. That's not in their best interests. And what often happens, particularly with children, I see this with adults as well, is that the child will say that they're worried, they're scared, they're afraid something's going to happen. And the adult tries to reassure them by saying, "You don't have any reason to be scared. There's no reason to feel that way. You shouldn't be scared." But the reality is that these are frightening experiences, and kids have a right to be scared, and we should allow them to own their own feelings. If you tell someone who is scared that they shouldn't be scared, that doesn't make them less scared. It just makes them less likely to talk to you, or less likely to take your advice. So if we dismiss the concerns of kids, we cannot actually help them cope with that distress. So I think what you do is you give appropriate reassurance, but if the person remains concerned, then you can say, "Well, I'm not as concerned as you are right now," or "I don't think it is as likely to occur as you do, but I understand you are worried." How do you then cope with that worry? And that's the next stage, is to encourage good coping. And one of the ways of doing that is to help people connect, to help them identify supports in their family and in their community. And you can also help them figure out how they can help others. Being able to help others makes individuals in crisis situations feel like they have more agency, more ability to do something positive, and that also helps with their healing. You want to give people accurate and timely information as a crisis is occurring, but you don't want to give them unnecessary and graphic details. Just enough information so they know what's occurred and they know what to do, but not all of the details that often we do find available to people. And then you want to suggest a referral source. Become aware of the community mental health resources so you can offer them to families that you serve, and your panel is going to help with that. And then you need to, in psychological first aid, end the conversation. And all of this should take about 10 to 15 minutes. So it's a very rapid process. Now, if you're a parent and you're working with your own, or you're supporting your own child or talking with your own child about something, you can still take some of these principles, but you don't have to end the conversation in 10 to 15 minutes, and you have the opportunity to continue to provide that support yourself. Now, one of the first steps in timely identification of children who would benefit from additional support involves recognizing some of the potential symptoms of adjustment reactions, and some of them are listed on this slide. I'm going to go over them as I had mentioned. I do want to say that the most common symptom is not on the slide, and that's no symptom. A lot of times children are not going to show their distress. And so if a child knew someone who was involved in a shooting directly or experienced the death of someone that they care about as a result, then you should be providing support to them even when they look okay. Same thing with adults. But these are some of the symptoms that you may identify children who are having more distress than you would anticipate by their exposure or their experience. So I'll go through this quickly because I think they're somewhat self-evident, and they occur in adults as well. So the symptoms can include sleep problems, trouble falling asleep, staying asleep, frequent wakening, difficulty waking up, nightmares. Any disruption in sleep can make it difficult for an individual to function. So for adults, they don't do their job as well the next day. For children, their job is school for a large part, and so they may not be able to function as well there. So attending to good sleep hygiene, making sure that you increase the likelihood that people can fall asleep and stay asleep is important. I do want to emphasize, though, I've done this work for over 30 years. I have not yet prescribed a medication for sleep. So when I say attend to the symptom, it is around sleep hygiene practices, not necessarily a medication. You may also see kids have separation anxiety and school avoidance. When something bad has happened, they may be afraid to separate from those they care about and those they count on to support them and protect them. So they may not want to go to school and leave there and be separated from parents or other caregivers. They may also be afraid that something might happen to their parent, sibling, or other caregivers if they're not there somehow to look out for them and to help protect them. So this happens even when the event didn't occur in school. So you can have a shooting in the community and kids may be afraid to leave home to go to school, even if they weren't at that event. Individuals who have been through very traumatic events, we understand why they might be anxious to return, particularly if the shooting happened at that site, like in school, but quite honestly, it is in the best interest of the child to transition them back to a school setting as quickly as possible with the appropriate supports and accommodations. So sometimes they won't want to go and are not yet ready to go back to the same classroom or the same school. They may only be able to go to the cafeteria and have lunch with their friends for an hour on the first day with a parent waiting for them in the office. So I'm not saying we just put them back into environments that they're not ready for without the supports. But if you just decide to homeschool them or keep them home for an indefinite period of time, it makes it very hard for them ever to return. So we want the expectation for recovery. So I'm a pediatrician by training, a developmental behavioral pediatrician. And when I talk with pediatricians, I tell them, please do not write those letters that excuse kids from going to school because they have been through a traumatic experience. Get on the phone and talk to the school and figure out how to get the kid back with the supports that they need. So you will also find that kids may have anxiety and trauma-related fears. Trauma-related fears, if they're, one of the school systems I work with had a mass shooting in the spring, and they contacted me because a question came up about the 4th of July, which was about to occur, and would they have concerns about would that be a trigger? And I'll talk about trauma trigger and grief triggers shortly. And so I actually did prepare for them some guidance to send home to families about what to do on the 4th of July, just to let kids know that loud noises and fireworks in particular may remind them of the sound of shooting, and so that may make that event more uncomfortable for them. They may wish to, for the first time they go to fireworks, not be in the middle of a crowd, but instead stand more to the periphery so that if they find it unpleasant, they can leave and they don't feel trapped. Maybe they don't go with friends, but they go with parents who can give them a ride home if they don't want to stay. And sometimes they don't even want to go, and that's completely all right. So you can anticipate some of these triggers and take steps for it. What people don't recognize as much is that kids may just become anxious. So they may be afraid of something that doesn't remind them specifically of the event, but is just something they might be afraid of. So you can have a shooting during daylight, but kids may become more afraid of the dark. And so that's part of what you just have to anticipate is some of that anxiety. You can also see difficulties with concentration, which leads to a deterioration in academic performance. So we work with schools on trying to, it's called differentiated education, try to figure out where the kids are currently capable, what level they're at in terms of their learning capacity, and adjust the curriculum to fit each individual child. The challenge with that, particularly in school shootings, is that the diversity is so great, and the educator was also part of it. So that, and I was talking in one school that had a very massive shooting, and they recognized the fact that some kids were struggling just to be in the school. They were having panic attacks, they were having great difficulty. There were other kids in AP classes that were going to college in a year, and they wanted the curriculum to pick up its pace. And I looked at the teacher and I said, and for you to just come in and stand in front of 30 traumatized kids is a lot to ask, perhaps more than we should be asking anyone. And the teacher looked at me and said, I'm lucky if I can do one curriculum, just one lesson plan. I can't be thinking of 20 or 30 different varieties. I can't figure out where each kid is. I'm just trying not to run out of the classroom. It's basically how they're often feeling. So that's why some of the supports we bring in, the academic supports for the educators as well. You can see regression. I think we all talk about that, kindergartner, it didn't have problems with going to kindergarten, and then a shooting occurs and they become a little more clingy and have trouble with separation. That's kind of a developmental regression. What people don't talk about as much is social regression. The kids may become more self-centered, more kind of not thinking about others as much, maybe intolerant of change, less flexible, irritable, immature. And we see that with adults as well. When we go into schools after school shootings, we'll often ask, are the teachers yelling at the students less than when the shooting happened? We don't ask if they're yelling at the kids. We just ask if it's getting better yet. And I have seen this among mental health professionals who do trauma work, that they've lost their temper as well after these events. So we just have to recognize that that happens to all of us. As you would imagine, kids can be sad after these events occurred, and you may see symptoms of depression. You'll also see substance use. I went to China after the earthquake in Sichuan province, and I was talking to staff at one school. It was a middle school. The building had collapsed. I think about 40% of the students and staff had died, and the other 60% were buried in rubble and dug out alive. So very traumatic experience. And I'm in a tent in a recovery community talking with one of the teachers. And I just said, how are the kids doing? And they said, well, they're middle school kids and they're smoking more. So tobacco was what he saw. And then I looked at him and I just said, how are you doing? He was standing next to his principal, and he didn't even pause. He looked at me and he said, I drink every night to go to sleep now. I can only imagine what he would have said if his principal wasn't standing next to him. So the issue is we'll see an increase in tobacco, alcohol use, and other drug use among children and adults after these events. And we have to think about how we're going to, when we plan recovery systems, we have to think about how we're also going to take care of substance use issues because they will be present in some individuals. Somatization is also common, so a lot of times children and adults will present with physical complaints and physical symptoms when they're actually in psychological distress. So we work a lot with school nurses because they see that. And they get a lot of kids coming to them with physical complaints, and adults, by the way, do it as well. The challenge is that you don't just see an increase in physical symptoms due to psychological distress. You see an increase in physical symptoms due to physical illness as well. I went to one school that had a shooting event that occurred and a couple kids who were killed, and I was talking with the principal on the day he returned back to school. It was a couple weeks after the event. The delay was because he had a heart attack and needed bypass surgery. And he looked at me and he said, I'm not the only one that's had a stress-related health problem? Do you ever see that after school shootings? And he said, because there are other staff who are having other health problems. And I just looked at him and I said, are you asking me whether you see an increase in stress-related health problems after a stressful event? And he said, yes. And I said, yes, you do. You do see that. And you can just imagine what that is like to be coming back after there's a shooting in the school and you're responsible for all the kids and you just had a heart attack and other staff are struggling. I mean, it's just enormous, I think, some of the impact on leaders in these events. And so the issue is because of stress hormones, you will see an increase in high blood pressure, an increase in asthma attacks, more problems with diabetes control. So you just see a range of both physical and psychological issues, and they all sometimes present to one person who has to kind of triage all of that and deal with all of that. I put down on this list also guilt. Because people somehow manage to find reasons to feel guilty, irrespective of their experience or their role in the event. And it appears that when something bad happens, people feel badly, and when they feel badly, they often assume they did something bad. There seems to be this phenomenon that after major crisis events, individuals may make a an unconscious choice, I should say, to assume some responsibility and guilt rather than to acknowledge they actually had no role in what happened. If you decide that it's your fault, then you give yourself the illusion of control. And you can say, if I don't make that mistake again, then this will never happen to someone that I love. And that you then have to deal with the guilt, and it is only an illusion of control, so it doesn't actually prevent it from happening again. So it's not a good strategy for dealing with it, but it seems quite common. And so that if you say to yourself, you know, my daughter went to that concert, and I should have never let her go to that concert because I knew it might be risky, because I knew there were going to be that many people here. So now whenever there are that many people in a room, I don't let anyone I love go into it. That isn't actually going to prevent people from dying. It's going to give you the illusion of control, but it also gives you the sense of profound responsibility and guilt. And I remember talking to one administrator. There had been a community shooting, and I talked about this phenomenon of guilt, and he said that was really helpful to hear. Because we had several years ago a couple students die by suicide, and I had a couple educators say to me that if I was a better principal, these kids would still be alive. And I have lived with that guilt for several years. So, and it was only after we had that kind of in-service training that he said, now we were able to talk about the guilt we all felt, and we're actually starting to heal as a community. So just because you feel guilty doesn't mean you are guilty, but you will find that children and adults will often feel some guilt. I've had people feel guilty because they survived the event or they weren't there. So there may be people who didn't go to the concert who feel guilty that somehow they were selfish and didn't, you know. So the guilt, it's survivor guilt, it's guilt for not having experienced loss or trauma. And that was a common comment that I got when I was here in Las Vegas for the first week, was people would say to me, you know, I feel guilty because I wasn't at the concert, I don't know anyone that died, and I am still upset about it. And it's not right for me to feel upset. There are people who have it far more worse than me. Well, of course it's all right for you to feel upset about something upsetting that's happened. You don't have to be the person who has the worst experience. You just should accept support if you had a difficult experience and might be helped by it. I admit you probably shouldn't step forward and demand to see the one mental health provider in the room when they're trying to help someone who has had a more, significant experience and is having more difficult coping. But it doesn't mean you can't talk to your friends or talk to your pediatrician or internist or someone else that's working with you just to say, I've been experiencing some distress. You have a right to that distress. So Calvin explains that he calls for his mom and he says, a big dog knocked me down and he stole Hobbs. I tried to catch him, but I couldn't, and now I've lost my best friend. And his mother says, well, Calvin, if you wouldn't drag that tiger everywhere, things like this wouldn't happen. And he points out there's no problem so awful you can't add some guilt to it and make it even worse. So I tend to reassure individuals of their lack of responsibility, even when there's no logical reason. You would think that they would feel responsible, but there actually are logical reasons. It's just not factually necessarily true. This slide, it goes over post-traumatic stress disorder. How many of you have not heard about post-traumatic stress disorder recently? I think you probably have been inundated and understandably. I mean, I think we've done a very nice job of getting information out to the general public about trauma symptoms and trauma disorders. And that is very important after traumatic events. And I don't want to say anything to minimize that. I'm going to go over the diagnostic criteria for two reasons. One is to mention a couple points that I think are most relevant, but the other reason is to raise some concern that we may be presuming that everything after a disaster is trauma, and the way we have now liberalized the diagnostic criteria for PTSD in kids in particular will start to make a lot of kids get that diagnosis when they're actually having other concerns or issues that should be managed in a different way. We tend, whenever we see someone who's upset or in distress, I hear people just go right to, oh, well, they have trauma symptoms, they have PTSD. And there are specific criteria, and the evidence-based treatments for trauma are really only for when you have the actual disorder. So to qualify for the diagnosis of PTSD, children must have been exposed to a traumatic experience, and that would be actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And that's either through directly experiencing or witnessing the event. But in children, we now allow those children to meet this criteria if they learn that the event occurred to a close family member or friend. So if a parent comes home and tells their child that the other parent died in a car accident the night before, that now qualifies for the exposure criteria for PTSD. So I'm going to go over the criteria and show you that a child that is grieving the death of a close family member from an accidental cause may now appear to qualify for the diagnosis of PTSD, even when they may be having instead bereavement. So I'm just using that as an example. You have to have the symptoms for at least 1 month in 4 core areas, and you have to have it in all 4 areas. We say it's for 30 days simply because trauma symptoms are so common after traumatic events that it's hard to know whether it's really a disorder. So there are acute stress reactions first. That does not mean that you wait 30 days before you get support or provide assistance to someone who has trauma symptoms. It merely means there are acute stress reactions. It's not yet post-traumatic stress disorder. So the first area is a re-experiencing of the traumatic event. That may be through recurrent, intrusive, and distressing memories or dreams. Now, in children, they don't have to actually recall or share the content of the dreams. So they can just say, I've been having scary dreams, and that is presumed to be the re-experiencing. But kids who have lost a parent through death often have scary dreams and don't sleep well. So they may appear to meet that criteria, even if it's around loss, which is the issue more than the trauma. Children do not need to have the dissociative reactions, those flashbacks, which are more common in adults than children. And they may also demonstrate that they're re-experiencing it through their play. We call that post-traumatic play, where they play out what has happened and they reenact it, and that's associated with more distress. And I can take questions at the end if you want to know more about post-traumatic play, but the point is that if kids are playing, that doesn't always mean they're working it through. It may actually be a sign that they're re-experiencing it. The second criteria is avoidance of stimuli, including even thoughts or feelings that are associated with the traumatic event. And that avoidance is a core symptom of PTSD. It's a diagnostic requirement. And that's part of the reason why you have to ask people about how they're doing after a traumatic experience, whether that's through questioning or screening instruments, because the individual does not want to talk or think about it. So they generally don't bring it up. And that's a core part of the disorder. And so the issue is that children and adults can go for months, years, and even longer without ever telling people about the symptoms that they are aware of. Because that would require them to talk about it. So you do need to look for it. But kids don't want to talk about deaths that have occurred either. They're going to avoid often talking about that as well. So they'll meet that criteria. Then it's negative alterations in cognitions and mood associated with the trauma. So that might be they have a distorted sense of why it occurred and feel guilty, as one example, or they may have, intense fear, horror, anger, or shame. Well, that's so common after these events, and quite honestly, it's very common after bereavement as well. So kids will often worry that they did something that caused someone that they love to die. I've done the work for over 30 years. I've only seen 2 or 3 cases where I haven't found guilt from that nature with bereavement. So that's not going to discern between the two. And then the last one is in a state of increased arousal. That could be difficulty concentrating or sleeping, which is very common in bereavement as well, irritability or anger, self-destructive behavior, hypervigilance, or exaggerated startle. Now, the reason I'm going over this and comparing it to bereavement is that there really are a wide range of reactions and concerns after a major crisis event beyond just post-traumatic symptoms and disorders. For those children who had a family member or friend die as a result of the crisis, bereavement might actually be the main concern for them. I was talking to one young man who was in a community shooting, not this particular one, and the person on either side of him was shot and killed. And it had been about 3 weeks. He had declined all counseling. He had come back to school once, but only stayed for an hour. And he wasn't really visiting with most of the people that knew him at the school. So I went to his house to talk with him. And I asked him, why aren't you in counseling? And he said, all I want to do is keep talking about the shooting, and that's not really what's bothering me. And I said, well, you don't leave your home? And he said, I leave my home every single day. I go and I meet with my friends who were there because they understand what I went through. He said, we're going camping this weekend. Everyone keeps assuming I'm scared, I'm frightened, I'm traumatized. That's not what's going on. He said, look, I had some symptoms for about 5 days. I didn't sleep well, I was jittery, I startled easily, but those went away. And I said, well, then why aren't you back at school? And he looked at me and he goes, it didn't seem right to be there without her. He was on a date with a girl he planned on marrying that he had known for most of his life. She was the person on one side that was killed. And to be in school without her didn't feel right. So I said, well, maybe you're grieving the death of your girlfriend. And he looked surprised, and he just paused, and he goes, that's it. And if someone's willing to talk to me about that, I'll go for counseling right now. I just don't want to keep talking about the shooter. But no one talked to him about his loss. They understandably perceive that there's a risk that he would have post-traumatic reactions. I don't debate that at all. But we can't presume that's what the problem is for each individual. We need to ask them. Now, it isn't just bereavement and trauma, though. Whenever you have these events, there's usually a cascade of secondary losses and stressors. So I'm going to use the example of kind of a natural disaster, such as a flood. What you'll find is the kids often have forced relocation, so they have to move someplace else because their home is destroyed. And then they lose their peer network, so they're not with their friends anymore. And then they have to integrate into a new school with a different curriculum, and they often then have academic failure. And then they have to just try and figure out how to integrate into this new social network. Then what happens is for the families, they often have financial stress. There's either unemployment or underemployment that occurs because of the natural disaster in this particular case. And then what happens is that leads to parental stress, which often leads to either a new onset or an increase in depression, anxiety, or other mental health problems in the parents, which then leads to marital conflict and domestic violence in some situations. So if you have a kid that comes to class because his parents were arguing last night, as they have been for the past month, about financial issues because mom lost her job because the flood resulted in the closing of the business that was tied to the tourism that decreased after the flooding occurred, and he's afraid that his parents are going to be divorced and that he's not going to see his mom or dad again. And you look at him and you say, what were you doing on the day of the flood? That's not the point. It's what's happening now. And that happens in shootings too. They often have financial ramifications. I'm not trying to predict anything in your own community, but there is always the concern that you'll have less visitors come, and that might lead to some people losing their job. So often there are these financial ramifications which follow. I was talking to one superintendent in a school that had a shooting, and she looked at me and she just said, well, you know, our enrollment is down in the school. Do you ever see that after a school shooting? And I looked at her and I said, are you asking me, are parents sometimes reluctant to send their children to a school where one of the children brought in an assault weapon and murdered several classmates? She goes, yeah, does that happen? And I go, yes, it does happen. What people don't recognize is that when the enrollment drops, so does the budget. Public schools are compensated by the amount of students they have. And if the budget drops and they have the same building, the same electric bill, the same heating, the same bus routes, they have to cut something. And often the only thing they can cut is the support services. So at a time when they're trying to recover from these events, they're laying off the support staff that would help them with the recovery. That causes problems with the educators and the staff and the families. Tax rates often drop, levies don't pass, sometimes there's strikes from the teachers. I don't think people realize that it's multi-year effects. So I'm not trying to predict doom in your situation. I understand tourism has been doing well here, and that's great. But sometimes people are not that lucky after events to be able to do that. So it can be the event, and it can be anything that followed the event. You know, as another example, I went to Sonoma after the wildfires there, and I was talking with a group of pediatricians, and they looked at me and they said, well, you know, we always ask, you know, was your home destroyed in the fire every time patients come in? And I said, well, that's a good first question, but it won't tell you the whole story. So when I was in New Orleans after Katrina, I was there about maybe 6 months afterwards. And I was talking to one of the educators, and she said to me, you know, look, I rented an apartment in the French Quarter, and it was completely undamaged on the day of the flood. I was very fortunate. And she said, but then about 2 or 3 months later, my lease ran up for the year, and my landlord doubled the rent because there was very little affordable housing in you know, downtown New Orleans. She said, and I couldn't afford that. So I had to move, but there wasn't any place to move that I could afford unless I moved about 45 minutes away. So I had to relocate, and I'm pretty much living out of the trunk of my car, but that also meant I had to take my daughter out of high school. And she became very sad by that, and then I ended up in an emergency room getting her antidepressants, but I couldn't get or arrange the counseling for her that she needed. Someone recommended maybe a pet would help, so I got her a dog, but then the dog attacked someone else in the throat. I'm going to court next week, and my attorney has told me that I will likely be bankrupt by this. So you can say her home was completely uninjured. That day was not the problem for her, per se. It was everything that followed. And these events do have these ripple effects that continue sometimes for months and years. And then to make it even more complicated, it's not just what happened that day or what happened afterwards, it's everything that preceded the event. So these crises have they sometimes have this effect where they will uncover prior loss or trauma in our lives, and that comes to the surface. And I had done some work with a school here in Las Vegas prior to the shooting, and they called me up the day after the shooting, and they said, we've already seen that. They had a student in the office crying because she was afraid her mother was going to die of a pre-existing illness that she had, completely unconnected factually with the event. But seeing people grieving on television made her worry that she might be one of those people herself. And that's what happens, is that it uncovers these other losses or stressors. And so actually, Pam, if you could, oh, you're going to do that. This next clip, which I'll advance the slide, this next clip really shows an example of grief triggers. It's only about 2 minutes long. As a little bit of an introduction, I apologize for that.
Right now, my biology class is studying blood vessels, and my dad died of an aneurysm. So we were talking about disorders, and my teacher talked about aneurysm, and she asked what could happen with an aneurysm, and I raised my hand and I told her that it could burst, and if that was in the brain, it could be fatal. So we talked about that, and it's not my biology teacher's fault. It's a unit. I understand that completely. But it's a reminder of how ironic things can be sometimes. Someone can say something that's not relevant to them, but it can have a really big effect on you. Today in Spanish class, actually, my friend Kate, she's a great friend of mine, we were joking because we had a biology test the previous period, and it was a pretty hard test. So we were joking, we were saying that we were gonna get heart attacks or we were gonna pass out, and she was like, hey, I have an aneurysm. And she was like, she just kind of began shaking and stuff, and I didn't get mad at her because she didn't understand, and I hadn't told her because I just met her this year.
On a Father's Day in 3rd grade, we were making bookmarks that said father, and then we would write words, and the teacher was explaining it, and I was like right about to cry because I couldn't make one. So I asked to go to the bathroom, and then I started crying in the bathroom.
Teachers look for overt signs, but grief is more subtle than that. It's not always Father's Day that's going to trigger a grief. It could be career day. It could be what does your parent do for a living that is going to trigger it.
So we work a lot with schools about how to anticipate, minimize, and then address grief triggers when they do occur, and similarly with trauma triggers as well. Actually, even the name of them, triggers, is a trigger for some people, which is unfortunate. I've even been told when you say on PowerPoint, the next bullet, that's also a trigger for some people who've been in shootings. So there are lots of things that remind you, and we probably need to think of other terminology, but that unfortunately is the terms that are used in the field. And so we just say, for example, if you're going to do a Father's Day card activity like that child went through, you can just introduce in the beginning and say, some of you may not have a father who's currently alive or living with you. You can still do the activity thinking about your dad, or you can pick another man in your life who has helped you and supported you. That way we can all do the activity. And then you let the kids start the activity and tell the kids, if you're having questions or you want to talk with me, just let me know, and I'll stop over. This again, what I'm trying to say is that we just need to be sensitive and aware. It's not that you need to sit down and go over an intervention for grief or for trauma. Other people should probably be doing that, but if you're someone who's a teacher, or if you're just working in another capacity with a child that's not clinical, there's still an awful lot that you can do to be sensitive. So you would think the kids would be distressed, and we'd see it, but they often aren't, appearing to be distressed. This is one of the posters Project Liberty put up about 6 months after September 11th in New York City, after the World Trade Center attacks. And they all had the same tagline: "If only the signs were this easy to read," but they're not. And children may actually withhold some of their symptoms because either it makes them feel that they're abnormal, or they don't feel people want to hear about it, or they see the adults around them visibly upset and they don't want to add to their burden, so they don't want to, add their symptoms on top of what they already see their parents are having difficulty with. And there is a lot of stigma associated with mental illness, and that doesn't go away even after a major disaster. So what I wanted to do is I just have 2 more points basically to go over before I just share with some resources and open it up to panel, is that there's a certain process of adjustment over time that you can see. And so if you think about it, there's a baseline that we have about our coping from day to day. And it is not a straight line. So there will be times when we experience distress or something bothers us. There's a tendency when people see someone in distress to say they're in crisis. Well, they're not actually in crisis if they're able to cope with it. They're just in distress. And so crisis events are not actually defined by the events themselves. Crisis event is an event that an individual, family, school, or community cannot cope with without external support. So it's a dynamic process that determines whether it's a crisis for any person or group, not the event itself. Now, the point that I would like to make, though, is if you are resilient and you are able to cope with it, that does not mean you're not in distress. So individuals who can cope with difficult events may experience the same degree of distress as someone who's in crisis. So if you see someone who's resilient or able to cope, whether it's your child, whether it's your CEO of your company, we still should reach out to them and offer support. That's what people should do to help with the recovery process. But I'm working now with the folks in Broward County after the shooting there, and a lot of people come up to me and say, those kids are resilient. Well, they are, some of them. The ones who are not resilient are not the ones that are traveling around the country talking and advocating. So I wouldn't presume that just because you see some kids who are resilient, that all of them are resilient. But just because they're resilient doesn't mean they aren't experiencing distress. I don't know if anybody watched the March for Our Lives and listened to the speakers. I actually went there because I was speaking for a congressional briefing the day prior. And there was one student who started to talk about a friend of hers who she watched get murdered. At the same time, she was also afraid that her life was in jeopardy. And as she was talking about it, she became quite emotional, as you would expect. And then she paused, and then she threw up. And there was a lot of support that she got from the audience. A friend, one of her classmates, went and held her hand. And then she started to speak again. And she just announced, I just threw up on international television, and it's great. And she just went ahead and gave her presentation, and then she ended by having everyone sing happy birthday to her friend because it would have been his birthday that day. Now, that is resiliency, to be able to do that, to overcome that level of distress, not only her experience, but her feelings associated with that experience. So I mention it because just because she's resilient doesn't mean her friend shouldn't have held her hand, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be offering support to her and all of the other victims of these events. I do want to say that some people will be resilient and they can cope with it, but doesn't mean we shouldn't still help them with it. So then a crisis event does occur. And at that point, people are overwhelmed and their usual coping mechanisms have been exceeded. And then at point D, their coping mechanisms have failed and they are in crisis. Well, what happens afterwards was what was already described in the introduction, was the communities come together. They offer support. And they do certain things, they come out with a lot of rubberized bracelets that have slogans on them. They put ribbons on themselves and vertical objects. They bake food in casserole format. They actually have the knowledge not to do in general situations because most people don't actually like casseroles that much, but they come together and there is something that's very, very welcoming and supportive of that. And you get this sense of community that you didn't have before. At a different level. And this is when I'm often in communities at this point and I tell them, whatever it is that you're doing now that feels good, commit to continuing it, because otherwise that will go away. And that would be another loss for this community. So if it's in a school and the PTA sends in food and the teachers gather with other staff and they share personal issues and they talk about each other and themselves in a way that they haven't done before that shows a stronger connection, we'll commit to having a potluck lunch once a month. Continue what made your community feel better afterwards, because otherwise that will go away. I spoke to one educator. She had been in a school with a mass shooting, and 3 years had passed, and all the students that were in the school at the time had graduated. And she looked at me and she said, these kids that we have now, they're just like the kids were before the shooting happened. Now, I think most people would have said, oh, that's great. I didn't. And I looked at her and I said, what do you think about that? And she said, after the shooting, the kids were more generous with each other and with me. They were sensitive. They were empathic. They checked how I was doing each day. And I needed that support. These kids are just as self-centered, selfish, and difficult. They don't ask me how I'm doing. And the issue is the kids graduated, but I'm still here, and I still need that support. She looked at me and she goes, I thought there was one good thing that came out of this shooting, and now I realize there's not a single good thing that has happened. So for her, the kids being just like they were was not the outcome she had been hoping for. So, I always tell people, they ask me, when are we going to go back to the way we were before the event? I always tell them, that's easy, never. You never go back to the way you were, and you never forget it. So it's always part of you. So then what does happen as you start to recover? Well, what will occur is sometimes weeks to months afterwards, individuals will start to do better. There's often the assumption, particularly in children, that if they are better, they're all better, and that we should just go back to routine. But being part better doesn't mean you're all better. And it's actually the most vulnerable time period. So 3 to 4 months after Katrina, I went to New Orleans on one visit. Healthcare providers could list the number of people they knew who had killed themselves since the flood. And there was actually a supplement to Pediatrics, the professional journal, that was dedicated to a young pediatrician who killed himself in New Orleans after Katrina. The time that is most vulnerable is not the immediate aftermath. It's when people appear to be back on track. You can come to Las Vegas a couple months afterwards, I did, and things look okay. Maybe there's a window that's boarded up here and there in the hotel where it happened. Some things are closed off, but the restaurants and the shows are still there, and it looks fine. And if you live here, you might start seeing everything back to what you think is normal, but not feel normal yourself. And that's where some people experience helplessness, hopelessness, and despair. So it's actually a time when everyone looks okay and you don't think you're okay and you don't think you're ever going to be okay, that you're really most vulnerable. Most kids will not harm themselves in that way, but instead they may just get a new baseline, which I just call continued impairment. They don't go back to their baseline. And what we have to do is continue the support until kids and adults are at least back at their baseline. And if we give them sufficient support and they have enough resiliency and coping, they may actually exceed their baseline, and that's what we call post-traumatic growth. So individuals are forever changed by these events, but they're not forever damaged. Sometimes individuals emerge from these events with a new sense of spirituality, more empathy, more strategies to be able to deal with adversity in the future, and they will face adversity in the future. We all do. And so they may actually decide that they'll enter into careers to help others. So I was showing this slide to a group of foster parents in a community that had a large natural disaster. And one of the dads just said, "I think that's me." And his story was that he was in finance, very successful, young married couple with a young child, and he was making a lot of money and was very happy. And then his child got sick suddenly of an infection and died quickly. And he said, all of a sudden, I questioned everything. And my career I didn't see value in it. Yes, I was successful in finance and I was making a lot of money, but what does money really bring you in life? So he quit his job in finance despite making a lot of money, went back to college to become a kindergarten teacher because he decided shaping the lives of young children, that's a career. I can feel satisfied with myself if I do that. He said, and then I became a foster parent, and I have a foster child that I'm going to adopt. And he said, I must have experienced post-traumatic growth. I see this all the time in education, in pediatrics, and social work, and all the helping professions. You will often see that people have gone through that post-traumatic growth. The problem with that is, if you are someone who's experienced post-traumatic growth, you've experienced trauma or loss, and that tends to be uncovered when you go to help others, because their stories start to unsurface the experience that you've had. So the very thing that puts us into helping professions often makes us most vulnerable to be affected by it. So the last point I really wanted to go over was really the importance of adult self-care. It's distressing to be with people in general and children in particular when they're in distress. And if your kids are crying or upset, it's hard to feel like you're actually helping them when you have these conversations or try and talk about what's happened, even if you are. So it's really important that as adults, we make sure that we get the support we need from other adults so that we can help our kids. I went to one community that had a very large mass shooting, and I met with government officials, the mayor and the board and other people. And one of the people in the audience said, this is affecting all of our kids. Even if you're, let's say, in second grade, you may be worried that one day you will have to go to that high school. And I looked at her and I said, it does affect all of the children here. I would suspect, though, most second graders are not actually thinking much about where they would be going to high school. They don't usually think about that when they're 7. I'm wondering, maybe it's even the parent that might be thinking about that. And she looked at me and she goes, okay, I have a second grader, it's me. I'm terrified that she's gonna have to go to that school. And I go, I completely understand that. So the point is, what do we do as adults so that, not that we are not upset, we have a right to be upset as well, but how do we start dealing with that upset? And you're gonna hear about the resources. So I'm gonna be very quick for the last couple slides because I want you to hear about that. But it isn't just that we have to help the kids, we have to help the adults as well, including ourselves. If you want more information, you can go to the National Center for School Crisis and Bereavement website. We also coordinate the coalition to support grieving students, so you'll find over 20 free video-based modules on how to support grieving kids. I showed you a couple video clips just to illustrate some of the things which are on that website. And if you want to reach us, this is the information about how to contact the center, whether it's by phone, through our website, and our email, info@schoolcrisiscenter.org. We have Facebook, Twitter accounts, LinkedIn accounts, link to us, like us, share us, do all of those things so that helps us to get, the word out more broadly. I'm not going to play this clip, but I just wanted to explain the web link that you have for a YouTube video. I worked with Gordimer Gibbons' Life on Normal Street, the writers for that children's show. It's on Amazon Prime, and they decided to have one of the characters experience the death of a parent in a car accident. And I worked with them, they knew how to depict grief in children, but I had them depict support in other children and adults in a way that doesn't typically occur. And they did that throughout the series. The show is no longer filming more episodes because the kids were supposed to be in middle school and they're clearly not middle school age. So they decided to end the series after about 3 years. But the episode right after the death occurred actually won the Screenwriters Guild Award for Best Children's Television Show about 1.5 years ago. That clip is not the show itself, it's me on the set of the show talking about what we tried to do. You've heard enough of me, so you don't need to watch something about me speaking, but they show the clips from the show that illustrate the point. It's only about 3 minutes long. And I think they did a really nice job in the show. And so I did not write the show, and I did not act in the show, and I did not direct the show. So I'm not taking credit for their award, but I think it's a really nice resource if you want to talk with kids about it. And then I think that's the last slide. I just wanted to say, I want to turn to now, where do you seek advice? Let's say you want additional assistance or support. You certainly can turn to your child's pediatrician or other pediatric healthcare provider, and that's why the Nevada chapter of the American Academy of Pediatrics is a co-sponsor of this. And we've written information that you've gotten in handouts that is already on their website, as well as some other sites we'll talk about. We've been working with the public school system, Clark County Public Schools, as well as we also did some work with the Archdiocese. There's community mental health, represented here through the Vegas Strong Resiliency Center, and then there's bereavement support, which is what is done through Adams Place. So at this point, I think I'm turning it over to Pam to start the panel discussion, and then you can ask questions of me and anyone else on the panel. But do you want me to first see if there are a couple questions? So I'll answer a couple questions now. And I will just ask that you go to the microphone because this is being filmed so other people can benefit from it. So there's a microphone right there. Or if you're shy, you can just say it and I'll repeat it, whichever you prefer. Do you have any questions or comments? Anything to add? Yes. Okay. Okay, so two very good questions. So the first one is about sleep, and the second one is, do you also see blame and anger occurring in addition to guilt? So let me start with sleep. So in terms of sleep hygiene, what I'm referring to by that is that there are certain steps that we each take to try and help us fall asleep. So it's things like, not doing stimulating things right before bedtime, not doing a lot of screen time with bright lights, bright lighting right before the child goes to sleep. So that's why most people institute certain kind of rituals which become associated with falling asleep, which might be things like taking a bath or a shower beforehand, reading a story, sitting and talking, praying, something that you do that helps you kind of calm down and start to be put into the place where you'll be more likely to fall asleep. Then you need to make sure that you're conscious about things like lighting, sound, making sure it's a comfortable temperature in the room. So those type of things, and then you can also, for kids who have difficulty falling asleep because they're anxious, teach them techniques to soothe themselves. So whether that's visualization, mindfulness, progressive relaxation, you teach them other strategies that make them feel calmer so they are more likely to fall asleep. But sometimes what happens after disasters, particularly when they're natural disasters, people may actually move or be in shelters, and the temperature isn't going to be what everyone wants, and some people are up late, and so the lighting it doesn't accommodate sleep for some of the people that go to sleep earlier. So what you actually have to do is put quiet hours into shelters, and maybe you place families in a different part of the shelter where it does become, and you can say that the lights are going to go down at 8 o'clock, and if you wish to stay up later, there is a room where you can go to do that. Of course, the parents may not be able to leave their children, particularly when they're young children, so they might have to be able to have task lighting that they can use so that the ambient lighting is okay for the others. But then, of course, some people want a completely dark, others like a night light. So it's trickier when you're in shelter situations. But when you're in a home, even if it's someone else's home, you want to recreate that environment that is associated with sleep. And that's what I was referring to as sleep hygiene. Your next question was about anger. So sometimes the individual feels guilty, but sometimes they will project that guilt onto others. And this we see all the time with shootings. And so I've worked with school systems where after a very large shooting, we've had several parents run for the Board of Education, and their entire platform is they want the superintendent and everyone on the board fired for allowing their kid to have died. And so we see that level of kind of anger, because the reality is, if the superintendent couldn't prevent that shooting and it wasn't a mistake, then there's nothing that's going to stop it from happening again. So there had to have been a mistake. People say someone had to have done something wrong, otherwise I have no reassurance this won't happen again. And so that anger may actually be a similar type of coping mechanism, but again, it's not really functional. If the person was actually responsible or failed to do something and hasn't learned by that mistake, I'm not going to talk, we could talk about forgiveness, but let's say they didn't make a mistake. They really followed best practices, and still somebody came in with an assault weapon and they were able to get through whatever reasonable security measures there were at the school at the time. If you just dismiss everyone, then you have a school system that's trying to recover at a time that strong leadership isn't present. And the people that come in, by the way, often are not well accepted. I went to one school, I was meeting with the staff. They had a complete turnover of their principal, assistant principal, head of guidance. And I was at a meeting with some of the teachers, and the teachers just looked, I remember they looked at the assistant principal and said, "There's nothing you can do that's going to make me feel safe in this school. There's nothing you can do. I am in fear every minute I'm in this school." The assistant principal started crying, and he was like, "I'm here to help." And then they looked at the principal and assistant principal, head of guidance, it said, "And we will never trust you because you didn't go through it and you can't know what we go through. And we will never accept you as one of us." I mean, just turning over everyone doesn't work either, to be quite honest. So sometimes what happens is that people they're understandably angry. I mean, I completely get that. And sometimes they express that anger at people who are not even responsible. I've gotten it on occasion, not often, but I've been in situations where people start getting angry with me because of remember this happening even with a child who was hospitalized and wasn't ready to get discharged. And I was cross-covering for someone. I had never even met the child or the mother, and she started yelling at me, just yelling. And I kept saying, "Ma'am, I understand you're disappointed your child's not ready to go home." And she goes, "Why weren't you here earlier? Why didn't you do it?" I'm like, I wasn't even aware I was cross-covering. Somebody called me and said, "The person went out a day early. Could you just run over there?" So I'm like, "Ma'am, I'm trying to help." And she just kept, and eventually I just said, "You know what? I'm going to step out of the room now, and I'm going to come back in about 5 or 10 minutes. She starts yelling at me. You're going to walk out on me?" And I'm like, "Yeah, because you're yelling at me. This isn't really helping. So I'm here to help, but I'll come back, and maybe you'll be calmer then, and we can continue the conversation. I'm not going away. I'm just stepping out." And I stepped out, and I came back about 10 minutes later, and she looked at me and she said, "I can't believe I yelled at you." And I go, "You know what? I don't take it personally. We hadn't even met. Let's just start over. Let's just do that. I get that. Your kid's sick. You haven't showered or eaten for 2 days. I get that. So let me figure out how I can really help you." I agreed to come in early, round on her child, discharge before rounds, do everything. And she just looks at me. She goes, "You would do that for me after everything I just did to you?" And I go, "Yes, I would do that for you. I would have done that even if you didn't yell at me." I didn't say that. It wasn't because she yelled at me. I'm like, that's what we do. We try and help. We're all here trying to help. And I get that you're angry. But sometimes that's really hard when everyone's doing that to you. When it's in the social media and there are all these attacks and some of the things being said after these school and community shootings. I mean, they're just unconscionable that people would start making these accusations against people who really were trying to help and to lead. And so it's very hard for those leaders. I'm not trying to make excuses for them, but it is really hard to lead in crisis. Does that answer your question? Yeah. But they may be angry at their parents. They may be angry at themselves. They may be angry at God. There's all, often the guilt and anger are pretty similar in some ways in some of the mechanisms. Yes. So the question was, for those who are watching the tape, what are some of the positive community responses that have been able to continue in communities after major crisis events? So I went to one community. They actually had a hostage situation that extended for a period of time before one of the kids was shot and killed. And during that time, the girl who was shot actually texted her parents, "I love you guys." And so after her death, because she was the one who died, her parents started the I Love You Guys Foundation. And what they would do was support projects that they thought continued the spirit of their child, who was generous and thoughtful and compassionate. And so when I was in the community, it was really visible. I mean, I'd be walking down the street and I'd go, "What's going on over there with the kids?" And they're going, "It's the I Love You Guys Foundation. They're reclaiming a vacant lot. They're repainting an abandoned building." And they started an award for the teacher who was the most empathic and supportive that the kids voted for. So they continued this. The foundation is still there, and the shooting was quite some time ago. And so what they tried to do was to continue positive things of support and assistance and empathy that I think became part of the culture of the school and the community. And you will see that in a number of schools and communities where they actually, sometimes what they do on the anniversary is a day of service. It's often what I recommend to schools because we don't want to relive the traumatic event, but maybe we can relive the sense of community and of helping others and the sense of agency to contribute. So, or some people are just, the school comes closer together or the community comes closer together. I don't know if you remember the shooting in Nickel Mines, Pennsylvania, in the Amish schoolhouse. I went out there and I was meeting with one of the families, and it was on Sunday, and I saw a police officer. They toured the school. They brought me to the new school and to the site of the old school, and there was a sheriff or police officer just sitting on the porch of the school. It was Sunday. It wasn't open. So I said, "Well, why do you have security now?" And they were like, "Oh, no, it's not for security. There's no students here. We get together now for breakfast on Sundays with the police. We've been doing that for 6 months. They were such a help to us. We feel they're part of our community. And they like being part of ours. So we just get together each week and we have breakfast together." And so that's just, so sometimes community forms in different ways. So I would look around and see, what have you done? What haven't you done yet that you'd like to do? Because you really shouldn't need a disaster to build community. I mean, it sometimes happens after community, but you can consciously do it in the absence of a disaster. But if there was something that felt good, where you supported people, where you donated things, where you helped out for the homeless, whatever it was, then just decide that was good. Let's keep doing it. That requires some commitment and energy. What I'd like to suggest is I want the panel to have time. So why don't I turn to the panel, and then there'll be opportunity for other questions afterwards, if that's okay. So Pam, did you want to take it from here?
Thank you very much, Dr. Schoenfeld. We have time now for each of the panel members to speak briefly about what their organization is providing, and then if there's still time for questions, they can also take additional questions. So would you like to begin?
Hello, thank you everyone for creating this opportunity to increase our competence our confidence in our community as we react to 1 October and to all crisis and all children coping with loss. My name's Kelly Thomas Boyers. I'm the co-founder of Adams Place. We've been providing peer support group, coping skills education, and activities for children coping with the loss, death of a parent or sibling or primary family member for 9 years. I lost my son 11 years ago, and I found a children's bereavement program in Reno, Nevada. Couldn't find one in Las Vegas, so after a year of searching, we received some funding from the 9/11 Foundation, Little Hope, to create a children's bereavement program here. We opened during the recession. Our doors were overwhelmed and continue to be overwhelmed. But through the strength of the training that we've purchased and we continue to fine-tune, we continue to be a cost-effective model to provide peer group settings for children at no cost and a parenting skills class. You can reach us at our website, adamsplacelv.org. And we operate through the school year. So we are 8 consecutive sessions with a topic-driven format, and children attend the 8 sessions and receive a certificate of accomplishment. We know that the younger children need to repeat, and they can repeat as often as they feel it's helpful to them. But then sometimes children take our 8 sessions and they're on their way, but then may need to revisit as they enter teen years. So we're committed to providing this opportunity through the course of their transitioning through grief and their school-based experience. We're located here on Rancho Drive, and we are available for on-site presentations at schools and hope to continue to do some on-site groups at schools as well. Any questions about what we do? Thank you.
I'll now have Terry Keener from the Vega Strong Resiliency Center come up.
I also want to say thank you. That was a great presentation, a lot of good information, and we appreciate you being here for this. My name is Terry Keener. I'm the Behavioral Health Coordinator at the Vega Strong Resiliency Center, and the center was established on October 23rd as a referral and resource hub for anyone impacted in any way by the shooting. And we do our best to connect people with services regardless of whatever it is that they're experiencing, and no matter how close or how far they were from the event. We know that this type of community violence has a ripple effect, and it reaches everyone, as I think Dr. Greenspun said in the beginning. But so we are available for, we also will do outreach. We can come and talk to your organizations about what is available. We will help with filling out applications for services and for the Victims of Crime program, who is also represented. Any questions about what the Resiliency Center provides? Yes.
Hi. So now that it's been a year since the event has happened, is the Resiliency Center going to open up to people who are trauma, or is it just going to be focused on October 1?
So the question is, now that it's been a year, is the Resiliency Center going to also assist people with other types of trauma, or is it focused on 1 October still? The focus will continue to be on the aftermath of the shooting, but we don't not answer the phone, and we don't not talk to people who call. So, you know, we probably would still talk with someone if they had questions about resources that they felt would be beneficial. Yes?
So can you speak at all about the Federal Victim of Crime Act and that opportunity to apply for that and I think at midnight on September 30th?
The Victims of Crime program deadline to apply is October 1st. You're correct about that, but I'm going to defer to Rebecca Salazar on that. She is here from that program, so she can answer those questions a little bit better probably. Okay.
I was at an event at one of my schools, an employee of ours who was a security guard at October 1. His wife, who's a nurse, was also there. Shooting started trying to get his wife to safety. She wanted to go help victims, and so both quite traumatized and have no idea about any resources.
And, we are still hearing that people are, things are either rising to the surface now or they've been dealing with it all year and they haven't found services, which is unfortunate because there are services available. And the Resiliency Center is really there for anyone who's impacted in any way. And the people that you're describing, their experience certainly was they were directly impacted. They experienced the event. They were in the same place at the same time, basically, but they experienced the event differently, and their reaction was different. And we find that to be fairly common. And so, we are there to help them either apply for Victims of Crime program or to identify other services that might be available to them. Yes. The phone number to the Resiliency Center. You have it? 7. Okay. I don't call the number. So 702-455-2433. And I did know that. I just didn't want to get it wrong. There's a toll-free number, and it's in your information. And then the website is vegasstrongrc.org. And on the website, there are links to the various press releases. There's some videos meant to help survivors and to explain how to apply and what they can apply for. There are some coping tips on there as resources, and there's some information about some of the community providers on the website. Thank you for asking. Okay, thank you very much.
Hello. As the representative for the Clark County School District, with regard to what our organization is doing, first of all, I want to thank David because he and Marlene Wong and Pamela Vona assisted my team with applying for the Project Serve grant immediately following to provide some funding so that we could bring in training. And that's basically what we did with those dollars. David and Marlene came in and did training immediately with counselors and social workers and our threat assessment team on how to best work with and support children who are dealing with trauma or grief. Their training was all day, and our employees did not want to leave. They appreciated the training so much. As well, we provided grief and loss training, trauma-informed care training, and yesterday, today, and tomorrow, our team is in the CBITS training, which is Cognitive Behavioral Interventions for Trauma in Schools. That training we provided to all of our social workers, as well as guidance counselors, psychologists, and threat assessment members. USC and David were gracious enough to provide resources like this handout that you picked up. There was a series of informational items, of which the local resources that you heard about, Adams Place and the Vegas Strong Resilience Center, information is included. We provided those materials to all schools, and they're really materials and resources to assist and support students, parents, and employees in not just this traumatic event, but with trauma in general. All of our students have access to guidance counselors on campus, and all students in Clark County have access to social workers, either through direct support because there's a social worker on the school campus every day. That's about 140 of our schools, or through a referral process. We have wraparound social workers as well that can be dispatched for incidents at schools where they don't have a direct support, social worker support on a daily basis. So those are some of the things that we have in place in the district to address the needs. Certainly, 1 October event we have seen needs in our schools, but on a general daily basis, I find that we are dealing with more students who come to us daily who have been impacted by trauma, traumatic events, crisis. That seems to be more common. And so anything we can do to help prepare our staff to best serve those kiddos that walk through our doors, because school is their form of normal for many of these kids. And so when they walk through our doors, how do we best support them so we don't re-victimize, re-traumatize, and that we're there to best support them? Questions? Thank you.
Good morning. I'm Rebecca Salazar. I manage the state's Victims of Crime program. Our program exists to provide financial assistance for victims of violent crime. We do that by paying medical bills that aren't covered by insurance or copays or deductibles, and a variety of other benefits, things like funeral payment, lost wages, counseling. Applicants have to apply to our program within a year, so that deadline that was mentioned for Route 91 victims is coming up. There are a couple exceptions to that. Dealing with children, minor victims of sexual assault have up until age 21 to apply, so that's important to know. We have our offices here local. I can give our website, and of course can answer any questions that anyone has. Yes.
Questions that I've heard, is that assistance that you're referring to specifically geared toward the attendees of the concert, or is that a coverall for anyone who may have been active, regardless if they were responsible or a student or whatever?
The question was, does a victim have to be directly impacted or present at the concert, or who is covered? Our parameters for coverage in victims of crime is a person has to be a direct victim. So for the concert victims, they either have to be present at the concert, or they have to be an immediate responder where there may still have been danger, or they may have believed that there was still danger to them. Other people who were impacted, like we get a lot of applications for people who may have been on the other end of the phone and their parent or loved one is at the concert calling them, and they're impacted also. So they would be covered under, through the Resiliency Center that Terry mentioned, where anyone impacted should contact them, and they will help figure out if an application to our program is appropriate, or they would be best served by other resources that are available. Yes.
Hi. Do you guys also pay for if people? You guys cover those bills, or is it just medical and funeral costs?
We do cover counseling up to $5,000 at this point. So we have a fee schedule that we would pay, and a victim would apply and then choose their therapist, and ideally the therapist would bill us directly for those services. Any other questions? Yes. Yeah, so the question was about alternative therapies that may be available. We can pay for alternative therapy. It's at a much more limited rate. So it'd be limited to $500 versus the $5,000. And those would be for things like you mentioned, acupuncture, massage therapy. There's all kinds of different therapies. Yes. Yes, our website is voc.nv.gov. Our phone number is 702-486-2740. My email's on the website, Rebecca Salazar.
Yeah, I just had one thing I'd like you to also comment on. Although the deadline is 1 year to apply to qualify, the deadline for spending the funding is not over in a year. So can you talk for how long they can still use these fundings for additional counseling in the future?
Yes. If a victim is being treated regularly, then their application, their account will remain open, and they will continue to pay until they reach the limit. If it's for counseling, it's $5,000. There's other limits. If an application goes dormant or inactive, it will remain open for 7 years after that inactivity date. So, if you're going to counseling for a year and then you drop off, at that point, you'd have 7 years to start again before we close and purge that application. Yes.
If they're already receiving counseling, do you guys retroactively pay that, or do you just go from when they apply?
No, we would date back from the date of the crime. So it would be retroactive back to that date, and we can reimburse a victim for anything they'd spent so far. Any other questions? Okay, thank you.
I'd like to thank everyone who's spoken today, all of your questions. Thank you very much to Clark County for hosting us today. And again, welcome our visitors. We thank you for coming today, and feel free to contact us if you have any further questions. Thank you.